And I want to thank you all for joining us here today at our listening session for public stakeholders regarding our efforts here to revise the definition of waters of the United States. We do have staff from EPA and the Army here with us today to listen to you and hear your initial input regarding our effort here to revise the definition in light of the Sackett Supreme Court decision. So first, I'm going to walk through a brief presentation, and then we'll turn to hear from our pre-registered speakers. So starting with the Clean Water Act, it is a foundational environmental statute, and it covers navigable waters, which in turn is defined in the Act as waters of the United States, including the territorial seas. Waters of the United States is that threshold term under the Act that covers the federal scope of geographic jurisdiction under the Act. The Clean Water Act, however, doesn't define this term, waters of the United States, and so since the 1970s, the agencies have defined that term in regulation. So this slide shows graphically how this term, waters of the United States, establishes the scope of federal jurisdiction under various Clean Water Act programs, and they're implemented by a variety of our co-regulators and partners. So we have Section 303 for water quality standards and TMDLs, Section 311 for oil spill programs, Section 401 for state and tribal certifications, 402 for pollutant discharge permits, and 404 for discharge of dredged or fill material. Now, you may ask yourself, well, why does this term really matter? And really, it affects the extent to which the Act provides protection over waters under the programs listed here on this slide. It also influences how states and authorized tribes for certain Clean Water Act programs can implement those programs. It may influence how states and tribes strategize for protecting their resources into the future, such as whether to pursue additional authorizations for Clean Water Act programs. And it influences how EPA and the Army will directly implement these programs on tribal lands in the absence of an authorized tribal program. Now, this slide highlights some key regulatory changes and Supreme Court decisions over time related to the definition of waters of the United States. So you see here in 1972, the Clean Water Act used the term WOTUS for the first time and defined it as navigable waters. As I stated, through the 70s, the Corps and EPA issued regulations and revisions to those regulations to define that term. In 1980, the agencies added the first exclusion to the regulation. Exclusions are those waters and features that are not jurisdictional under the Act in the regulation. And so for the agencies added the addition for waste treatment systems as an exclusion at that time. And then in 1985, the Riverside Bayview Homes Supreme Court decision was issued. That one addressed adjacent wetlands. Subsequent to that, EPA and Army issued regulations in 1986 and 1988 to really address that Supreme Court decision. And so they issued, again, revised regulation there. In that regulation, there is also a preamble to the rule itself, which includes discussion and guidance and more description of the terms used throughout the regulation. And one aspect of that preamble are what we call preamble waters. And these are waters generally not jurisdictional by the determined by the agencies. Now, these waters were not in the reg text itself. They were in the preamble. And that'll be important in a future slide. In 1993, the agencies added another exclusion to the regulation, this one for prior converted cropland, which is a term used by USDA. In 2001, the Supreme Court issued a decision in Solid Waste Agency of Northern Cook County, or SWANC, and that was addressing certain other waters, which was a category found in the agency's 1980s regulations. And subsequent to that, the agencies issued guidance in both 2001 and 2003 to address implementation post-decision. In 2006, the Rapanos Supreme Court decision was issued, and I'll talk about that here in a future slide because there's some really critical key terms used in that decision that are relevant to our action here. And that decision addressed wetlands adjacent to non-navigable tributaries. And once again, following that, the agencies issued guidance in both 2007 and slightly revised version in 2008 to address implementation. Along the way after that, the agencies issued several final rules defining the term in 2015, 2019, 2020, and again in January 2023. Following that January 2023 rule issuance, the Supreme Court issued their Sackett decision addressing wetlands adjacent to non-navigable tributaries. And subsequent to that, the agencies issued what we call a conforming rule to amend the January 2023 reg text to conform to the Sackett decision, and that was effective in September of that year. And I'll talk about that in more detail here. So the Rapanos decision first, as I stated, in 2006, the Supreme Court was divided and they issued a 4-1-4 opinion on the question of Clean Water Act jurisdiction. Those 1980s regulations you saw on the timeline, those weren't directly in front of the Supreme Court. However, the court did create two tests for jurisdiction under Rapanos. So under the plurality opinion, waters of the United States were relatively permanent, standing or continuously flowing bodies of water, forming geographic features described in ordinary parlance as streams, oceans, rivers, and lakes. In addition, wetlands that have a continuous surface connection to bodies that are WOTUS in their own right, so that there's no clear demarcation between wetlands. In addition, there was a Kennedy concurring opinion, and that opinion considered WOTUS to include that a water or wetlands must possess a significant nexus to waters that are or were navigable in fact or could be reasonably so made. And you saw in that prior timeline, subsequent to this decision, the agencies issued guidance, and those guidance documents used both tests to establish jurisdiction. So EPA and Army can use both of these, the plurality and the Kennedy, to establish jurisdiction at that time. Similarly, when the agencies moved to promulgate a new definition in 2023, it also included both tests. So moving to the Sackett decision, as I mentioned in 2023, that was in May of that year, it's important to note that the January 2023 rule wasn't what was really before the court. However, the court did consider the jurisdictional standards under that rule in their opinion. And the Supreme Court concluded that the significant nexus standard was inconsistent with their interpretation of the act. So they concluded that the Rapanos plurality was correct. So these are those relatively permanent waters I described on the prior slide. The court also agreed with the Rapanos plurality that adjacent wetlands are WOTUS when those wetlands have a continuous surface connection, as I described on that prior slide. So moving towards what the regulation looks like now. And really, this is if you open what's called the Code of Federal Regulations, this is what the regulation looks like currently. And this is the regulation before the agencies that we believe needs further revision in order to conform to the Sackett decision. So paragraph A of the rule outlines the jurisdictional bodies of water, traditional navigable waters, interstate waters, territorial seas, impoundments of jurisdictional waters, relatively permanent tributaries, adjacent wetlands, when they have a continuous surface connection to a requisite jurisdictional water. And then the last category is intrastate lakes and ponds, not identified. They're really not in any of the other jurisdictional categories, but they must meet the relatively permanent standard. The next paragraph outlines, if you recall, those exclusions I mentioned. These are waters or features not jurisdictional in the regulation. So these first two you'll see look familiar from the timeline. Waste treatment systems, prior converted cropland, those are maintained in the regulation text as an exclusion. In addition, if you recall, I mentioned these set of preamble waters from the 1980s regulations. Those were generally not jurisdictional. The agencies also in the Rapanos guidance, for example, identified other generally non-jurisdictional bodies of water. And essentially what the agencies did is took those out of the preamble and guidance documents and added them to the regulation text itself as an exclusion. And I do want to highlight one here, the B3 for certain ditches, because that one is a critical one that we'll talk about here regarding our current effort. So currently the exclusion for ditches includes ditches, including roadside ditches that are excavated wholly in and draining only dry land and that do not carry a relatively permanent flow of water. So moving to the final paragraph of the regulation, it outlines the definitions. Most of these definitions are long-standing in agency regulations, definition for wetlands, high tide line, ordinary high water mark, and tidal waters. Adjacent, the definition there was amended by the agencies in the 2023 rule in order to conform to the Sackett decision, and it was defined as having a continuous surface connection. So for those of you who are familiar with WOTUS, this won't be a surprise that we have litigation on the definition. And as a result of that ongoing litigation, the agencies are implementing the amended 2023 rule in 24 states, the District of Columbia, and the territories. And you can see those in green here on the map. In the other 26 states, the agencies are interpreting WOTUS under the pre-2015 regulatory regime. Essentially, it's the regulations and bodies of guidance documents and things in pre-2015, in addition to making sure those conform with Sackett. And those are kind of that lavenderish color here. So now we're going to move to why we're here today and some of our recent efforts and what we're taking action on moving forward. So we did hear concerns from stakeholders that the agencies are not properly implementing continuous surface connection, as well as other aspects of the definition of WOTUS in light of the Sackett decision. So the agencies on March 12th of this year issued a guidance to address proper implementation of continuous surface connection in order to be consistent with the law of the land under the decision. And this guidance really clarifies that the agencies are interpreting continuous surface connection to mean abutting or touching a requisite jurisdictional water. And through that effort, the agencies also rescinded portions of trainings or guidance documents that state that certain discrete features can provide a continuous surface connection to make clear the only interpretation the agencies are currently implementing is the abutting or touching. So we really see this as an important step to align the agency's interpretation and implementation of the term of adjacency in light of Sackett. That same day, the agencies announced their intent to undertake a rulemaking to revise this definition once and for all. And so we're going to talk about that here in a second. This is my favorite part. We also signed a public notice that day called WOTUS Notice, the final response to SCOTUS, which outlines a process to gather recommendations on the meaning of key terms in Sackett to inform our future administrative actions to clarify that definition. So this notice did publish in the Federal Register on March 24th, and the recommendations docket closed on April 23rd. However, we are still wanting to make sure you guys understand these listening sessions. Any comments, recommendations that we received during these listening sessions are equally weighted with anything we got on the written docket. We also initiated in March federalism consultation and tribal consultation efforts. So as we embark moving forward, we have a set of guiding principles that is driving us. And we're wanting to ensure that implementation aligns with the law, with the Sackett decision. We want to focus on clarity, simplicity, and improvements that stands the test of time. You saw that timeline. This definition's been revised in the past many times, many Supreme Court decisions. We need to define this once and for all that will stand the test of time. We also want to prioritize practical implementation approaches. A regulation can only go so far if it cannot be implemented, so we need to make sure it's implementable. We also want to provide for durable, stable, more effective and efficient jurisdictional determinations and permit decisions, and consider the experiences of all of you and the input we're receiving from states and tribes and local governments and a diverse array of stakeholder groups. So this slide actually lists our other engagement opportunities. In addition to this one, we've had some in April, we've had some in May. This is our second session of the day, but first day of the general public listening sessions. We also have another one coming up on May 29th. So be on the lookout for that if you or anyone you know is interested in providing input. And that will be in Salt Lake City, Utah. And you can do this, participate both virtually and in person on that one. And more information and registration is available on the web link there listed on this slide. So what are we really seeking input on? Moving forward, we're interested in obtaining target in really three critical key topic areas. And these should look familiar from those prior slides, given what we discussed in the Rapanos and Sackett Supreme Court decisions. We have the scope of relatively permanent waters here and really what features this phrase applies. So we're seeking input on what characteristics can help us identify relatively permanent or define that. Is it flow regime? Is it flow duration? Is it seasonality? Are there other things we should be considering defining this term? And then also, how can we identify relatively permanent in the field? The next topic is the scope of continuous surface connection and which features this applies. And again, we're seeking feedback on defining the term continuous surface connection, including what does it mean to abut? What does that actually mean? Also, does it include wetlands behind a natural berm or other natural landform? Do those features indicate a continuous surface connection exists? And whether certain features such as flood or tide gates or pumps or similar artificial features do or do not remove a wetland from being considered adjacent. The third topic we call the fan favorite is ditches. And I do say that not lightly because ditches does seem to impact lots of the spectrum, right, of our stakeholder groups. And so on this one, we're including, and wanting to hear recommendations on what type of characteristics can we use to identify which ditches are jurisdictional and which ditches are not jurisdictional. Is it related to flow regime or physical features of a ditch, biological indicators, or something else? In addition, we're also seeking input on whether we should define a ditch, which we did under the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Laura, and she's going to walk through the most important part of the session today, listening to you all.
Stacy, do you mind advancing to the next slide?